can see my slides. And yeah, thank you for welcoming me here. Let me see if I can put that full screen or not. Okay, that's not accessible. Anyways, thank you for having me. I think I'm the only designer in the whole room, maybe not, but, oh, you're also a designer, good. Oh, you too, great. So I promise that I'm one of us. I was JavaScript developer before, and JavaScript burned me out, so I'm now a designer, and I have some images in my slides and a little bit of moving content. And if you also have troubles with seeing white text on black background, which is a sign of astigmatism, you don't have to pay attention to those. I'm going to explain that. Yeah, so today it's 12th Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and it's funny because accessibility have been around for 30 years or more, and yeah, it's a little bit weird that we still have that problem, and actually the problem increases every year because before we had JavaScript and all of the fancy stuff and animations and libraries, we were more accessible. Yeah, so I want to also recognize the effort from organizers for accessibility this year, because we also say a lot of how we never have enough accessibility, and it's good if we recognize that. This year it has been information on the website, and you also send reminders, so thank you for that. That's applause from me. And yeah, I would like to take a moment to introduce my disabled cat. He has 3 legs, and he's actually not aware that he has disability, so he tries to scratch himself with a leg, and he doesn't have it. And for the formal part, I'm an ex-software engineer, and I transitioned to design, and I work on GitHub Copilot and GitHub, and today I'm going to represent my own thoughts and only myself. In this slide, you have a picture of my white cat and black and white and my job title. And my goal today is to give you ideas on how you can build a strategy on accessibility a little bit further from JavaScript and DOM order and focus management, but more on how you can be prepared for the future to come. And the future is, of course, here and at GitHub, and accessibility and IE, it's almost a daily topic, and more products are going to ship IE solutions, and we have to be prepared. So accessibility can be intimidating, and it was for me as a front-end developer. I was really intimidating when I wanted to code a carousel or tabs, and this is the piece of code that I have been seeing a lot in my code bases. So that's a div with on-click and delete text. That's not an accessible button, and it's not even a button. And now developers and designers and inclusive writers, we are responsible for our product's accessibility, but today it's a little bit of a bigger paradigm, and depending on the scale that we are working on, semantic, HTML, DOM order, and color contrast issues are not all of the issues that we have. And I made this mistake in the past where I was talking about accessibility from a position of developer. From my code editor, I was just giving some ideas and talks within my company in development department, and it ever made further than that. So it just stayed at that little room. And what we need to have is a strategy, a clarity, and a cultural shift. And we have to think about all aspects of the product, and it goes up to security, performance, social media, language, and how we advertise our product on when it comes to social media. It's a business decision too, because we have to talk about lawsuits, which we shouldn't be driven by the danger of the lawsuits, but rather think about empathy and lawsuits that is looking at you combined. And also, accessibility relates to technical depth. You can't build on top of a broken product, and it's going to be very tedious to you. And oftentimes, accessibility forces us to rebuild something with the promise that this time is going to be accessible, but it's often not. We just rebuild the same inaccessible thing all over again. And today we have to ship accessible products very fast. There is a lot of eye sparkles everywhere. And yeah, so to start thinking about IE, we can talk about IE design specifically for people with disability, like this one. That's the solution for, I think it's called Be My Eyes app, which is a guide for people with disability that allows you to recognize objects. And there are other IE solutions that allows you to have transcripts and a lot of useful things. And if we invite people to play around with IE solutions, we should allow all people to come and play. And this example is from Notion, and it says to you that it's a photo editor like one click. And this is not accessible example because there are some people who have never seen a code editor in their lives, and one click is not exactly the action that they can perform. So assuming that every company has full-time accessibility specialists available to help at all moments, like GitHub or Microsoft, it's not realistic. And a lot of companies don't have a full leadership support and permission. So we have to build a sustainable strategy for accessibility for our day-to-day work. And for that, we have to remember principles that have been there forever. That's websites that have to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And those standards will never change. So they maybe one day, but not tomorrow. So we can perfectly build up on that. And to think about accessibility, there are 3 pillars of it. So first, that there is a compliant solution. First, that our product is compliant and usable. And third one, and rarely anyone ever gets there, it's compliant, usable, and joyful. And to talk about compliance, we have to talk about WCAG. That's a Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and that's a special language that you kind of have to learn anyways, and there is no way around it. And I've built templates. I've used templates years ago, and this one is built for us. And some people do that in Notion, some people do that on GitHub issues. That's not sponsored. And when it comes to the set of rules that are developed for us, it's for us up to our for apply. And you can learn about A, double A, triple A, what everything that you have to know about accessibility is kind of in there. And you can start applying that. And I talk about applying that. It's better if you start very small and maybe very, very small. And a lot of people have been showing a button example. So that's another one. And this is how you kind of go from inaccessible div to something a little bit more accessible. And that's a pure decorational slide. Please don't use div, even if you try to apply more functionality to it. Don't use div as a button. That's the only thing that I ask you for. And yeah, imagine if we apply all of the knowledge that we learn from the specs to just one component, and that's button. Well, you can also build up on that. And this is, architectural investment that some people call design system. That's also an accessibility investment. And it can cover some basics for you before you realize that, and before you go and you build with specs in your hand. So design system can support units, it can support accessible forms, it can support theming, focus management, motion utils, wherever you can imagine, you can build your accessibility in there. I also ask you to please be very careful about libraries that are out there, because that's not, sometimes it's not tested with people with disability, and you actually have to be very sure if you put something like that in production. And yeah, so this example is Gestalt from Pinterest. There is also Typeform, Kit, Lion, GovUK. There's many design systems that you can go to the source code and just see how they implement components and how many utils they have, and whether one component is reviewed for accessibility or not. That's also a good indicator of documentation, that if some component is tested and you have your, all of the documentation how to use the component, you also have documentation on how to use component accessibly, like what labels it needs and whether it's been reviewed or not manually by people. And design system is where accessibility starts for many people, and it also stops there. So they fix tokens and components, and they track improvements, and they say that's all I have, and all of that is accessible. And essentially, if you zoom out, where you usually test accessibility, with some kind of a browser tool, is on the homepage. And when you test it on the homepage and you see a bunch of failing, sometimes it's failing because it's failing on its base, and that's your tokens and your accessible components. Sometimes it's failing because the usability doesn't make sense. And you have to differentiate those. And if you have covered your base and you're sure that your components are accessible and your tokens are passing contrast, you still have to involve a designer to test everything out. And for us, like for you, developers, the good idea to ensure our solid base is to implement automated testing. And accessibility testing finds around 50% of accessibility bugs. That's what people say. We don't know if it's true, but that's how we usually present it. And you can use Cypress, you can use Playwright, non-sponsored. You can use accessibility insights, Apply tools, and anything else. And you can also set GitHub action that would check whether you have broken accessibility in your new PR or not, and you can, think whether you want to merge it. And I heard this question many times, whether accessibility have to be a part of your CI. Essentially, yes, because you don't want to merge something that is broken. If your test is broken for other reason, you wouldn't merge it, or you wouldn't release that. So if you set up best test practices for accessibility, you are a little bit more safer. You can also design your test. So that's Magenta Ali. It actually gives you user points, like the story on how you want to develop your test before you write your component. So it's essentially a shift from building, testing, and shipping another feature to building, testing, and shipping another accessibility feature before it goes to production. And I've thrown this slide in here because that's JavaScript conference, but Vue.js and Next.js are the ones who already doing a lot for accessibility, and we can go and learn from them, and all of the information, it's already out there. And this is another one, a very good example that you can go to the collection of web accessibility, and you find a lot of tools that you can check and you can learn from. So whose job accessibility is? And some of the developers and designers can be aware of the problems, but remediation steps kind of takes a lot of experience, and it's very hard to fix something that is broken. And if we don't want to fix something that is broken, we can just start a little bit earlier and think about accessibility as an outcome, not the process. And the process is inclusive design, and it starts very early. And a developer who is testing a bulletproof testing coverage should not be the only and the first one to think about accessibility. And good pattern for focus management and for navigation sequence, it has to be designed because that's a part of user flow. A developer cannot guess where the next focus should go. A developer can test whether button receive focus. That's good, but it's out of our scope to design the sequence, and you have to go and talk to your designer. So designer can prepare landmarks for you, focus and tab order, and the question that you usually might have, whether I should use area label or area label by, you don't have to think about that if your designer took care of it. And this is, annotations for design, it's tricky topic. Not many designers do them, but if you kind of explain why you need that and why it's part of the design, you can have a more solid team. And design can also help you to partner with product. And before you get the request to build the feature, your designer can, stop product requests from just by saying that this feature is not accessible and we need a little bit more time to make it accessible. And, you shouldn't be, as a developer, you shouldn't be the person who fights for accessibility towards leadership. You need another layer in between. And so how do I know if something is accessible? And you essentially don't until you ask your users. And many interfaces suffer from severe accessibility issues because we are very biased by our own standards, and even by asking for user feedback, a group of users that are not diverse enough. And that's a good question for leadership as well, that why we're getting feedback from users who are essentially a group of people who are not diverse in their abilities. And we have to bring up that a product has to be compliant and usable, that we have to test with users. And user testing provides assurance that the experience is as intended, and it includes compliance, and it includes the experience. It's both of them, and it's actually a lot of fun that you can see people with disability use switch controls or voice control. There's a lot of things that I had no idea about, and I saw them interacting with it, and it's a lot of fun. And testing that the product is compliant, it's probably the first thing that you want to check if you go towards usability testing. Then you can test that user can achieve the task. So the product is accessible if crucial workflows are achievable. If people cannot complete the onboarding process and cannot submit the form, you are failing on crucial workflow. And once user can achieve a certain task, we can ask them whether they understand the context. So that's copies. And if they stuck, can they find documentation easily on your public website? Because if that's failing, like if your product is accessible, but your public website failing, how do you, if the person is stuck, how can you assure that their experience is okay? We cannot only ask people for improvements for their current compliant experience. We can also ask them how their accessible experience look like. For example, I didn't know how to, I was designing something and there was a question whether it should be a radio buttons or a menu, like a drop-down menu. And we had a luxury of asking a person who is using screen reader daily and not sighted what they prefer. And that shaped the design process, and it made us rethink whether we even need this feature. And this is absolutely unexpected, and it just drives product in different directions. Yeah, so this is the way that we can ensure that product is compliant, usable, and joyful if we ask user how their experience look like. And even if you don't have the person who would say to you that radio buttons are confusing, you can also test it with yourself. So if you have ADHD and if some of the people in this room has color blindness, you can also help your designer to test things, or you can do it yourself by doing manual testing of your components. And I always could do it, and I didn't know I should. So I have been working for 5 or 6 years as a developer, and I didn't know I should test with my components or my feature with people with disability or people with diverse range of abilities. And the question here is, how do I make my products accessible in 2023? Because you would say that I didn't give you the recipe, and essentially the recipe is this one. There is no shortcut. There is no library that can give you accessibility and you're done. You actually have to build up a knowledge base. You would want your design system to have built-in accessibility because that would give you a solid foundation, and if you include testing coverage, you help yourself and your team not to break things in the future, because you'll never have a perfect team where everyone is aware of accessibility. And if you build a lot of good things, some people in 2 or 3 years can break it, so you want a good testing coverage. And you also want to test with people with disabilities to make sure that crucial workflows are achievable by people, not by Cypress, by people. And you can essentially be quite sure that your product today and tomorrow is going to be accessible. And you can go as deep as you want on each step. So some people can, stop their careers on accessibility testing, or you specialize in user testing. So all of these are different pillars that you can apply in your daily work. And if you have to build something very fast, which is like IE solution or anything, if you have 3 of these steps are covered, it's going to be very easy for you to add a new feature. I also invite you to think that disability does not define people. What defines disability is the environment. And we will not be able to use mouse if it's taken away from us. And in this environment, we would rely on keyboard accessibility or voice controls. And depending on the environment that we are in, we are able to do something or we don't. And no one benefits from low contrast or poor copies that it doesn't make sense to people who, it doesn't help functionality. Maybe it upsells your product. And sometimes we are too biased to see those things. And you essentially have to involve and open up as a company and get feedback online instead of, being in your corner and just hoping that no one would notice, because people will notice. They will feel unwelcomed and they will silently leave. And the result of the team effort, if you make this shift left, is that your product essentially have better user experience because you have tested it so many times that it is essentially much better than it was before. And you would also increase your revenue because you probably avoided a lawsuit and you invited more users in. And essentially, accessibility is not do it right or not do it at all problem. It's, there's no way for us to fail. We only fail our users if we look the other way and if we completely ignore what we have to do. And I invite you to check GitHub Design's Journey Towards Accessibility on GitHub blog. This is also not sponsored. It's because I think it's very interesting to see how it applies on a bigger scale, and it also makes you understand how much easier it can be for a company in 20, 30, or 40 people. And it can give you some ideas on practices, and it's going to be much easier for you when you want to add IE to your product as well. And yeah, good luck and happy Accessibility Awareness Day.